In ophthalmology, Mouches Volantes are free-floating particles in the eye's vitreous, which impair the eyesight of the person affected. The common English term for these is eye floaters. Such opacities of the vitreous can have different causes. In most cases, they are age-related rather than pathological. In bright light conditions, the shadows of these particles are projected onto the light-sensitive retina and thus become visible to the viewer as small rings, dots and strands which appear to fly through the visual field, following the eye's motions. Eye floaters are widespread, in itself harmless, and not effectively treatable with our current medical means. This explanation of Mouches Volantes makes sense to us, even if we are not ophthalmologists, because it refers to our everyday realm of experience accessible with our intellectual mind. When the eye floaters attracted my attention for the first time, however, it happened in an environment that was quite different from that in which our everyday experiences take place. In this way, I was confronted with a totally different interpretation of these dots and strands floating before my eyes. At this point in time, I had already learned the art of focused consciousness development from a person who lives in the remote solitude of the Emmental region in Switzerland. This man, who calls himself Nestor, as well as my experiences in the vicinity of the headwaters of the Emma River, triggered a development within me which caused me to radically change my life habits and views of the world. In the course of this alternative way of living, my visual perception eventually changed as well. I began to see and get to know exactly these dots and strands. Ever since, the eye floaters are my object of study and concentration. In a world dominated by materialism and rationality, it is totally understandable that this phenomenon is interpreted as particles in the eye. Nestor counters these paradigms with his own uncommon experiences resulting from seeing the Mouches Volantes. Seeing in this case does not mean the ordinary sensual perception, but an immediate realization beyond all rational thought, brought about by ecstasy techniques and resulting in an insight into a deep consciousness of the origin of what we call and take for granted as our world. In this sense, the act of seeing is directly related to the Mouches Volantes. In this environment, I tried to figure out whether there is more to the phenomenon of Mouches Volantes than just particles in the eye. In other words, whether it is possible to prove the main assertions in the teachings of the seer Nestor to be true, namely, that the eye floaters are the initial parts of a shining, basic structure formed by our consciousness, which organizes our everyday perception of objects in our field of vision, making them appear sensible, and that the mystical entering into one sphere of this structure will enable us human beings to maintain our consciousness beyond the point of physical death. The discrepancy between particles in the eye and shining structure of consciousness is considerable, so that both explanations can exist side by side, at best in our rational thinking, but not in our feeling and acting. This is important because the act of seeing, which is supposed to bring about insights into the phenomenon of Mouches Volantes, is not just an intellectual exercise. Rather, it requires an appropriate way of living. This novel is based on a true story and will give insights into the worldview and practice of that mystical way of living in which the notion of particles in the eye is at best a distraction from seeing, from directly seeing the shining structure of consciousness. The man was silent. For a moment, we looked each other over. He was of middle age, slim, but made a physically strong impression. The most striking features of his face were his pronounced nose, his full lips, and his 3-day beard. Black, curly hair protruded from under his gray-brown felt hat. The clothes he wore were different from the common collar shirts and woolen pullovers of the local inhabitants. He was wearing a white, long-sleeved undershirt with a dark green, sleeveless jacket over it. His hands were hidden in the pockets of his white jeans, and the black rubber boots, stained with soil, indicated that the man sometimes moved around in marshy terrain. I introduced myself and told him that I'm living and studying in Bern. With a certain feeling of pride, I added that restoring and selling furniture would be a part-time occupation of mine. He replied that his name was Nestor. For a while, we informally talked about furniture and its restoration. In the course of our conversation, it turned out that he was the owner of the house and that he himself also was familiar with furniture restoration. He didn't seem to know much about Mari Egli and the piece of art in his stable. It had already been there when he purchased and took over the house, he added. Finally, I told Nestor that I would be interested in the secrétaire. I deliberately did not mention anything about purchasing or paying because I knew that people sometimes appreciate it when they can get rid of their rummage for free. Nestor, however, did not want to give the object away. He explained that Mari Egli's secrétaire belongs to this place and nowhere else. I tried to talk it over with him, but he was stubborn and didn't want to change his mind. When I started to mention money and payment, he abruptly ended our conversation by wishing me a good evening and disappearing in his house. On this day, I returned to the village with empty hands, but I decided to stay another night. I was confident that I could persuade Nestor to sell the secrétaire after all, because my impression was that he was not really interested in that piece of art and that he simply tended to stick to his possessions, even if that was old, useless rummage. So, on the following day, I again drove up the left side of the Emma to that piece of furniture that I wanted to have by all means. Nestor, however, rebuffed me another time. "I don't understand you," I told him. "You could benefit from it." "You really don't seem to understand," he replied. "This particular piece of furniture is not restored that easily. It requires a high degree of attention to handle it correctly. If you are missing that attention, this piece of furniture would rather cause more harm than benefit." "I'll take care not to damage it. I'm always alert and mindful," I assured him. Nestor remained silent, and so I kept talking at him. "You don't have to make a decision right away," I finally said. "I can come back later, once you've made up your mind. I can wait, no problem." Nestor looked at me inquiringly. "You can? How long can you wait? What do you think?" I shrugged. His question came as a surprise to me. "Well, let's say till tonight." My idea was that I would spend the intervening time down at the pub, getting a good meal and reading some papers. "That's not much time." Nestor shook his head. Then he said it would be time for me to go. To me, Nestor's attitude was somewhat provocative. I wanted to show him that I'd be able to wait for a longer period of time. So, a week later, I returned to the Emmental and asked him once more to sell that secrétaire. Nestor was, in my view, a smart wheeler-dealer. He kept me in suspense so as to push up the price of the object. He could afford it because he had quickly realized how much I cared about that secrétaire. Consequently, Nestor was not surprised at all when we met again. I tried to convince him with logical arguments, explaining that he'd no longer need that piece of furniture anyway, that it would just rot in this place, that I could restore the secrétaire to something valuable and useful, and that I would pay generously for it. And as I expected, he finally relented. We agreed on confirming the deal in writing. However, Nestor named two prerequisites that had to be fulfilled, no fail, before he would sell the secrétaire. The first prerequisite was unusual and laborious. He insisted that the restoration be done here on his property. This meant that I would not be able to have the object at my disposal until the restoration would finally be completed. In addition, he demanded that no one else than I was supposed to work on it. I pointed out that it would be too expensive and time-consuming to me to drive from Bern into the Emmental every day. But Nestor offered me a room on the upper floor of his house where I could live for free as long as I would work on the restoration. To me, this was an inconvenience I readily accepted, knowing the secrétaire would be mine once the restoration was finalized. Nestor's second prerequisite, however, was not the least bit surprising to me: cash in advance. I fixed my gaze on a strand familiar to me. For quite some time I played with it, holding it in suspension in the center of the picture, or shifting it horizontally across the misty but bright sky. The longer I did this, though, the more it changed. To my surprise, the strand, in fact transparent, didn't only turn smaller and become more sharply focused, it also started to light up. I quickly realized that looking at the strand in this luminous condition was something that didn't last for very long. One wrong movement of the eyes, too strong or too lax, or one look at the environment was enough to make the strand assume its original size again and lose its luminosity. Several times I focused on this, and each time the strand lit up again after some time. Concentrating on it for a longer period made the strand light up more intensely, even brighter than the environment. At the same time, however, I also noticed the same luminosity in the dots in strands immediately surrounding the one I focused on. All excited, I told Nestor of my perception. "What you've seen is the light of consciousness," he said as if it were self-evident. "You can see it because you have compressed and condensed the layers of consciousness, but this time you did so without moving your body." I asked him what that meant. Instead of answering, Nestor pointed to a large bright stone to our right and asked me to superimpose my strand over this particular stone. When I had managed to do so, he instructed me to walk up to the stone without taking my eyes off the strand. It took quite a few attempts, but then I managed to hold the strand in suspension and at the same time move up so close to the stone that I almost touched it with the tip of my nose. In amazement, I realized that the strand turned smaller and started to light up when I approached the stone, just like I had observed it before when looking at the sky. Then Nestor asked me to stretch out my arm and superimpose the strand over the palm of my hand. Now I was supposed to hold the palm of my hand close up to my face while still looking at the strand. The same thing happened here as well. The closer I held my hand in front of my face, the smaller and more luminous the strand became. "That is concentration," Nestor finally explained. "The light of consciousness becomes better visible due to your concentration. When seeing, you can experience directly and firsthand what concentration actually is. It's scaling down the section of the picture you look at. In the process, the space you spread the light on is smaller. Or in other words, you are compressing the layers of consciousness. If you walk up to an object or if you pull it towards you, it means on the outer screen that you can look at a smaller section of the object, magnified, richer in detail, and more sharply focused. You did the same when we were talking about the layers of consciousness, when you pressed your cup against your forehead. But back then you couldn't see what was happening simultaneously on the inner screen with your basic structure. Now you can see directly that the dots and strands become smaller, but at the same time more focused, intense, and luminous. And that's concentration. Nestor considered it a progress that from now on, I wouldn't have to look at the outer screen any longer in order to concentrate myself. Concentration, according to him, came about by seeing the basic structure independent from the material world. I pointed out that I was able to also concentrate on things such as thoughts, ideas, and memories without having to directly perceive the material world either. "That's no real concentration," Nestor replied determinedly. "People believe it's concentration when they ponder over something. But what is their attention actually doing in the process? It is constantly being realigned. People in thoughts relax time and again when they don't fix anything with the eyes and hold the picture in suspension. Full concentration, on the other hand, means that you can hold your dots and strands in suspension so adroitly that they don't flow away any longer. Today you've seen that shining light for the first time. And starting today, you should, when looking at your dots and strands, apply enough attention and concentration each time so that your basic structure starts to light up. Therefore, the way your dots and strands appear when looking at them will show you your actual level of concentration.